The corrupt judge framed the wrong man. He had no idea the FBI was already watching. The gavel came down at exactly 9:14 in the morning, and Judge Raymond Voss did not look up from his papers. He never did. In 22 years on the bench, he had learned that looking up was for men who were uncertain. Raymond Voss was not uncertain. He had not been uncertain in a very long time. The courtroom in Harlan County was the kind of place that made people feel small on purpose. The ceilings were tall. The wood was dark. The light came through narrow windows at angles that always seemed to hit the defendant's face and leave the judge in shadow. Raymond had noticed that years ago and had quietly ensured the maintenance crew never adjusted the blinds. He liked the shadow. He had worked hard for it. Outside, the morning was gray and cold, the kind of cold that settles into bones and stays there. A white panel van sat in the parking lot across the street. It had been there for 6 days. Nobody on Raymond's staff had noticed it. Nobody on Raymond's staff noticed much of anything, which was partly by design and partly because Raymond had spent years hiring people who were very good at looking the other way. Marcus Hale sat at the defense table in a gray shirt that was a size too big. He was 23 years old. He had never been arrested before. He had never been inside a courthouse before, except once when he was 16, and accompanied his aunt to a civil matter involving a landlord dispute that was resolved in under an hour. He remembered thinking the building smelled like old paper and floor wax. It still did. He had been arrested 4 days ago during a sweep in the Westfield district. The officers who took him into custody were calm and professional, which Marcus found more disturbing than if they had been rough. Calm professionalism in the wrong situation means someone has already made a decision. The decision had clearly already been made. Marcus had been walking from the community college registration office to his car. He had a folder under his arm with his course enrollment forms for the spring semester. He was going to study logistics and supply chain management because his Uncle Darnell had told him that was where the stable money was, and Marcus trusted his Uncle Darnell more than he trusted almost anyone. He had the enrollment forms. He had a receipt from a gas station 42 miles away, purchased 2 hours before the alleged incident, because he had stopped for a bottle of water and a pack of gum on the way back from visiting his cousin. He had his phone, which showed his location data clearly and without any ambiguity. None of that had mattered. The public defender assigned to Marcus was a man named Gregory Sloan. Gregory Sloan wore a watch that was too expensive for a public defender's salary, a fact that would later become relevant. He had shaken Marcus's hand once, briefly, and had then spent most of their 40-minute meeting explaining why it was important to appear cooperative and not combative with the court. He had not once asked Marcus where he actually was on the night in question. Raymond Voss reviewed the file that morning not because he needed to, but because he had learned long ago that the performance of diligence was as important as diligence itself. He flipped pages. He made small notations. He looked like a man doing his job with tremendous care. What he was actually doing was making sure the timeline was clean. There was a surveillance record from a camera mounted on the corner of Westfield and 4th that would have placed Marcus Hale nearly a mile from the site of the alleged incident at the exact time it occurred. That record had been flagged internally 3 days ago by a junior officer who had forwarded it through proper channels. The forwarding chain had ended on a desk belonging to a lieutenant named Paul Greer. Paul Greer owed Raymond Voss a favor that was now 11 years old and had never stopped being owed. The record had gone nowhere. Marcus sat at the defense table and looked at his hands. They were steady. He was not a man who showed his fear in his hands. He showed it in how still he went, like a thing that had learned early that stillness was sometimes the only protection available. He had told his Uncle Darnell everything. Darnell had listened without interrupting, which was unusual because Darnell almost always had something to say. When Marcus finished, Darnell sat quietly for a moment and then asked a single question. He asked Marcus if he still had the receipt from the gas station. Marcus said yes. He had it in his jacket pocket. He had not thrown it away because he was not the kind of person who threw things away without checking them first. Darnell had nodded slowly and said he was going to make some calls. Marcus had asked who he was going to call. Darnell had said he was not sure yet, but that he would figure it out. And when Darnell said he would figure something out, he generally figured it out. He was 61 years old and had spent 34 years as a postal worker, and had learned that the right piece of paper, delivered to the right person at the right time, could do things that shouting never could. Back in the courtroom, Raymond Voss set down the file and folded his hands on the bench. He looked out at the room with the measured calm of a man who has spent decades practicing measured calm until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. He set the next hearing date. He assigned the timeline. He spoke with the precision of someone who had decided how this ended before it began. Gregory Sloan, at the defense table, wrote something on his legal pad and did not look at Marcus. Marcus looked at the judge. Raymond Voss did not look back. In the parking lot, the white panel van sat with its engine off and its interior very quiet. Inside, two people sat in front of monitors that showed multiple camera feeds from multiple angles around the courthouse and the street. They had been doing this in shifts for 14 months. They were not impatient. Patience was the entire job. One of them poured coffee from a thermos and handed a cup to the other without speaking. They watched Raymond Voss's car in its reserved spot. They watched the entrance. They watched the timestamp on their equipment cycle forward 1 minute at a time. One of them was a woman named Carol Deming. She was 44 years old and had worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 19 years. She had spent 14 of those months on this specific case. She had a folder on her desk that was 4 inches thick and growing. She had surveillance records, financial records, call logs, and the testimony of 2 confidential informants whose identities she protected with a ferocity that people who worked with her described as almost personal. She watched the courthouse entrance on her monitor and did not say anything. Her partner, a younger agent named Philip Carr, looked at her at one point and asked if she wanted to move on anything yet. She said no. He asked how much longer. She said as long as it takes. Philip nodded and looked back at his monitor and understood that was the end of the conversation. What Carol Deming knew, and what Raymond Voss did not know, was that the case she was building was not just about one judge. It was about a network that ran through the Harlan County court system, through 2 precincts, through a bail bond operation, and into the financial infrastructure of an organization that had been moving money through legitimate businesses for the better part of a decade. Raymond Voss was not the center of it. He was a mechanism inside it. A reliable, well-maintained mechanism that had been doing its job without error for 11 years. Right up until Marcus Hale walked into his courtroom. Marcus Hale was clean. That was the problem. Not just legally clean, but documentably, provably, time-stamped and receipted clean. And when a clean man gets put into a dirty machine, the machine does not just chew him up quietly. It makes noise. It draws attention. It draws exactly the kind of attention that a federal investigation, 14 months in, cannot afford to have drawn in the wrong direction. Carol Deming had known about Marcus Hale within 18 hours of his arrest. One of her informants had flagged it. She had pulled his record in under an hour. She had looked at the gas station receipt timestamp, the location data, and the suppressed surveillance record, and she had sat very still for a long time. Then she had made 3 phone calls. She had not told Philip what was said on those calls. She rarely told Philip everything, not because she did not trust him, but because the fewer people who held certain information, the cleaner the eventual case would be. She was building something that had to hold up in a federal courtroom in front of a judge who had no connection to Raymond Voss whatsoever, and she was going to build it correctly or not at all. Marcus Hale walked out of the courthouse that morning on the temporary release terms that had been set at an earlier appearance. He stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the gray sky and breathed cold air. His enrollment forms were still in his apartment. He had not been back to the registration office. He did not know when he would be able to go back. His uncle Darnell was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, watching his nephew come down the stairs with the careful eyes of a man who was already working on a plan he had not yet fully explained. He told Marcus to get in the car. Marcus got in the car. Darnell drove them to a diner 3 miles away, ordered 2 coffees, and placed on the table between them a folded piece of paper with a name and a phone number written on it in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Marcus looked at it. The name was not a lawyer. The name was a journalist. Darnell said she had been asking questions about the Harlan County court system for almost a year. He said he had heard about her from a friend whose nephew had gone through that courthouse 2 years ago under circumstances that were, Darnell said carefully, not right. Marcus picked up the piece of paper. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the enrollment form he had been carrying since the day this started, because he had decided that carrying it was a way of insisting, quietly and privately, that this was going to end with him going back to that registration office. The white van was still in the parking lot when the courthouse doors closed for the afternoon. Inside it, Carol Deming looked at a photograph of Raymond Voss pinned to a board, alongside 17 other photographs connected by lines and dates and dollar amounts. She looked at it the way someone looks at something they have been looking at for a very long time, not with anger, with the specific, settled focus of someone who knows exactly where the story ends and is simply waiting for the moment when the evidence agrees. She did not move, she did not speak. She waited. Darnell had the texts going back 3 weeks. Every message Marcus had sent him, time-stamped, with the location metadata intact because Marcus used an older phone model that embedded location data by default and had never turned the feature off. There was a message sent from 42 miles away at 7:18 in the evening on the night in question. There was a follow-up message 20 minutes later asking if Darnell wanted anything from the gas station. There was a photo of a bag of chips Darnell had requested, taken inside the gas station, with the store's interior clearly visible in the background. 3 photographs, 11 text messages, 1 receipt, 1 location log. Darnell had organized everything into a manila envelope the night Marcus was first released. He had printed the text screenshots on his home printer and written the timestamps by hand next to each one in case the digital versions were somehow disputed. He had placed the gas station receipt in a small plastic sleeve he had purchased from an office supply store. He had labeled everything clearly. He had done it with the care of someone who understood that paper, handled correctly, was its own form of argument. He had called the journalist the morning after his conversation with Marcus at the diner. Her name was Caroline Webb. She worked for a regional paper called the Harlan Courier-Tribune and had a small but very specific reputation among people who paid attention to such things, which was a reputation for not letting things go. Caroline Webb had been tracking the sentencing patterns in Raymond Voss's courtroom for 8 months. She had started because a defense attorney had mentioned to her, offhandedly, at a local bar association event, that the plea deal acceptance rate in Voss's courtroom was statistically unusual. She had not been sure what to do with that at first. Statistical anomalies in legal proceedings were not exactly front-page material. She had filed the comment away and moved on. Then a second attorney had said something similar at a different event 3 months later. Different words, same idea. She had gone back to her notes. She had spent the following 5 months pulling every publicly available docket from Voss's courtroom going back 4 years. She had built a spreadsheet. She had consulted with a law professor at the state university who reviewed the data and told her, in careful academic language, that the pattern was worth investigating further. She had gone further. What she had found was a sentencing record that, on its surface, looked like the work of a tough but consistent judge. Longer sentences for repeat offenders, firm handling of cases involving moving of stolen goods, a documented preference for denying bail in cases where the defendant had prior failures to appear, all of it defensible, all of it explainable. Except that when she cross-referenced the defendants with known affiliations to a specific distribution network operating in the southern part of the county, the pattern inverted. Defendants with those connections received lighter sentences at a rate that could not be explained by the legal factors involved. She had checked her math 4 times. She had asked 2 different people to check it independently. The math was correct. She had not published anything yet because she did not have the mechanism. She had the pattern. She did not have the money, the communication, the hand that moved between the network and the bench. Without the mechanism, the story was a theory. Editors did not publish theories. She had learned that early. When Darnell called her, she answered on the second ring. He told her he had a nephew in Raymond Voss's courtroom. He told her the situation. He told her about the enrollment forms and the gas station receipt, and the suppressed surveillance timestamp that Marcus's court-appointed lawyer had told him, in a very quiet voice during a very brief conversation, probably did not exist and should not be mentioned. Caroline wrote everything down. She asked Darnell 3 questions. She asked him to send her copies of the text screenshots and the receipt scan. She told him she would not use any of it without telling him first. Darnell said he appreciated that, and that he had heard she was someone who meant what she said. Caroline said she tried to be. She hung up and sat at her desk for a long time staring at her spreadsheet. Then she opened a new document and began organizing what she had. The new document was not an article. It was a timeline. She built it chronologically, every data point she had, every docket entry, every financial record she had obtained through public records requests, every conversation she had documented. She put Marcus Hale's case at the bottom of the timeline, the most recent entry, and looked at how it fit against everything that came before it. It fit perfectly. That was the thing that bothered her most. Marcus Hale was a completely innocent man, and his case fit perfectly into the machinery she had been mapping for 8 months, which meant the machinery did not care about guilt or innocence. It only cared about function. 2 days after her call with Darnell, her phone rang from a number she did not recognize. She answered. A man's voice, calm and measured, asked if she was the journalist who had been covering the Harlan County court system. She said she was. He said that he was aware of her work, and that he wanted her to know that other people were also aware of certain things, and that it would be in everyone's interest, particularly the interest of Marcus Hale, if she did not publish anything she currently had for approximately 2 weeks. She asked who she was speaking with. He said he was someone who needed 2 more weeks. She asked why she should trust a request from a person who would not identify himself. He said because in 2 weeks she would have a story that was significantly larger than the one she currently had, and that the story she currently had would not save Marcus Hale, but the larger story would. There was a pause. She asked how she could verify anything he was telling her. He said she couldn't, not yet, and that he understood that was a difficult position to be in, and that he was sorry for that, but that it was necessary. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked him one more question. She asked him if Marcus Hale was going to be all right. He paused before answering. It was not the pause of someone who did not know the answer. It was the pause of someone who was deciding how much of the answer to give. He said that was exactly what he was working on. The call ended. Caroline Webb sat at her desk and looked at her phone, and then at her timeline document, and then at the ceiling for a while. She did not publish anything. She kept building the timeline. Marcus, meanwhile, had gone back to his apartment and sat at his kitchen table with his enrollment forms spread out in front of him. He had not put them away since the arrest. He looked at them every day. It was not a dramatic thing. He did not look at them with speeches in his head or powerful feelings that needed narration. He just looked at them because they were evidence of the direction he had been going before someone else decided to change his direction. And looking at them was a way of insisting, without words, that the change was not permanent. He called his mother that evening. He told her things were being handled. She asked by whom. He said by people who knew what they were doing. She asked if he was eating. He said yes. She told him to call her tomorrow. He said he would. He hung up and looked at the enrollment forms again. Outside his building, 2 blocks west, a car sat at the curb with its lights off. Inside it, a young agent named Philip Carr was eating a sandwich and making notes on a tablet and watching the building entrance out of professional habit rather than any specific directive. Carol Deming had asked him to familiarize himself with Marcus Hale's block as part of a broader logistical survey she was running. She had not explained more than that. Philip finished his sandwich, made a note of the time, and drove away. In the van, Carol Deming looked at a new photograph that had been added to her board that afternoon. It was a photograph of Gregory Sloan, Marcus's court-appointed public defender, entering a building that her financial records showed was associated with a holding company connected to a man named Victor Reese. Victor Reese had 3 businesses, a clean record, and a phone that was currently on a surveillance list that Carol had obtained a federal warrant for 5 months ago. Gregory Sloan had been in that building for 40 minutes. Carol wrote the time and date next to the photograph. She added a line on the board connecting Sloan to Reese. The board was getting very full. She stepped back and looked at all of it. Every line, every photograph, every dollar amount, every timestamp. The whole architecture of it, built over 14 months with the patience of someone who understood that the most important thing was not speed but completion. She looked at Marcus Hale's name, written on a small card and pinned at the edge of the board where his case had entered the picture. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached for her phone and made the second of the 3 calls she had been planning. Carol Deming had a problem that she had not discussed with anyone. Not her supervisor, not Philip, not the 2 confidential informants who had spent months feeding her precise and reliable information about the network's financial operations. The problem was that Marcus Hale was scheduled for sentencing in 11 days. 11 days was not enough time for Carol to complete her case and move in a way that would hold up in federal court. She needed the full picture. She needed the financial trail to close completely. She was waiting on one more set of bank records that had been delayed by a processing issue at the institution, and she had a second informant whose testimony she needed to formally document before she could move. Neither of those things would happen in 11 days. But if Marcus Hale was sentenced, 2 things would occur. First, an innocent man would go to prison for something he did not do, which was not acceptable. Second, and more relevant to the architecture of her case, it would create a point of legal vulnerability that defense attorneys for the other 11 people on her warrant list would exploit in court. They would argue that the entire investigation had been contaminated by the handling of the Hale case. They would not be entirely wrong. The case could hold together despite that argument, but it would be weaker. Weaker meant risk. Risk meant the possibility that the people at the center of this network, the people who had been running money and influence through the Harlan County system for a decade, might walk out of a courtroom free. Carol did not intend to let that happen. Her first call had been to a colleague in the Bureau's legal division, asking a very specific procedural question about the replacement of court-appointed counsel under certain documented conditions of conflict of interest. The answer she received was exactly what she needed. Her second call had been to a woman named Irene Cole. Irene Cole was a defense attorney with 26 years of experience and a firm that had, in the past decade, represented 3 federal whistleblowers and 1 congressional aide during a sensitive investigation. She was not connected to any of the people or organizations in Carol's case. She was, in Carol's assessment, the right person for a specific and delicate task. Carol had not told Irene the full picture. She had told her enough. She had told her that a young man named Marcus Hale had a court-appointed attorney who had a conflict of interest that could be documented, that the documentation would be made available to Irene through a channel that would not expose the federal investigation, and that Irene's job was to file a procedural motion that would remove Gregory Sloan and insert herself into the case. Irene had asked why. Carol had said she could not say everything yet. Irene had been quiet for a moment and then asked one question. She asked if the young man was innocent. Carol said yes. Irene said she would file the motion. It took Irene 4 days to receive the documentation Carol had arranged, 2 days to prepare the motion, and 1 morning to file it. Gregory Sloan received notice through proper channels and responded with confusion, and then with a sequence of phone calls that Carol's surveillance caught in their entirety. The calls were illuminating. They went to 3 different numbers. 2 of those numbers were already on Carol's warrant list. The 3rd was new and was added immediately. Raymond Voss received word of the attorney replacement the following morning and responded with a very controlled and very brief expression of annoyance that he allowed himself only in the privacy of his car, driving to the courthouse. By the time he walked through the front doors, the expression was gone. He was calm. He was measured. He was the picture of a man with nothing troubling on his mind. He looked up Irene Cole's firm when he reached his chambers. He sat at his desk and read about her professional history for 7 minutes. He told himself it was a coincidence, a procedural complication. It happened. Courts had procedures for exactly these kinds of things, and the procedures had been followed, and that was that. He straightened his files. He prepared for his afternoon calendar. Outside in the parking lot, Philip Carr watched Raymond Voss's car in its reserved space and relayed the judge's arrival time to Carol by text message. Carol noted it in her log. She then turned to the financial records that had finally arrived that morning from the processing delay at the bank. She opened them and began reading. She read for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling of the van for a moment. Then she called her supervisor and said she needed a meeting. Her supervisor asked if it was the Harlan case. Carol said yes. Her supervisor asked if it was ready. Carol said almost. She said she needed 8 more days and 1 more piece of documentation, and then it was ready. There was a pause on the line. Her supervisor said he would move the timeline. Carol thanked him and ended the call. She looked at the board. She looked at every line and every photograph and every timestamp. 8 more days. Marcus Hale met Irene Cole for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room at the county legal aid office, which was the most neutral space Irene could arrange on short notice. She came in carrying a leather briefcase and set it on the table and looked at Marcus for a moment before she said anything. Then she said she had read his file. Marcus said okay. She asked him to tell her, in his own words, where he was on the night in question. Marcus told her. He told her about the registration office and the drive and the gas station stop and the bag of chips his uncle had asked for and the texts and the receipt. He told her about the enrollment form still sitting on his kitchen table. He did not say that part dramatically. He just said it as a fact, the way facts sound when they are simply true. Irene listened without writing anything down. She looked at him the whole time he spoke. When he finished, she said she believed him. Marcus looked at her. She said that was not just a thing she said to clients. She said she believed him specifically, based on the documentation she had reviewed and based on the timeline, and that her job now was to make sure the court arrived at the same conclusion. Marcus said he had not had anyone say that to him since this started. Irene said she was sorry it had taken this long. She opened her briefcase and they began. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Raymond Voss placed a call on a cell phone he kept in the inside pocket of his jacket, not on the office phone, never on the office phone. The call was brief. He asked a single question. He received an answer that clearly did not satisfy him because he ended the call and sat still for a long moment, looking at the surface of his desk. The call lasted 43 seconds. Carol Deming's team had it recorded in full before Raymond. Voss had put the phone back in his pocket. She listened to the recording once, noted the content in her log, and added a final line to the timeline document she had been building for 14 months. She looked at the completed timeline. She looked at it for a long time. Then she began preparing the paperwork that would need to be ready in 8 days. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and still. Marcus Hale put on the same gray shirt he had worn to every court appearance because it was the best shirt he owned that fit properly. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not searching for confidence or composing himself in any particular way, just looking, the way you look at something you are trying to memorize. He picked up his enrollment forms from the kitchen table and put them in his jacket pocket. He had carried them to every hearing. He was going to carry them to this one. Irene Cole was already in the courtroom when he arrived, standing at the defense table with her briefcase open and papers organized in a specific sequence she had prepared the night before. She looked up when Marcus came in and gave him a small nod. He sat down beside her. The courtroom filled slowly. The gallery had the usual assortment of legal staff, a few observers, a reporter from a local outlet who covered court proceedings as part of a general beat. Nothing that looked unusual to anyone who did not know what to look for. There were 4 people in the back rows who were not press and not family. They sat separately, not near each other, distributed across different sections of the gallery. They each had a legal pad. They did not look at one another. They wrote things down at intervals and otherwise watched the front of the room. Raymond Voss entered from the side door and took the bench. He arranged his papers. He looked out at the courtroom with his usual settled expression, the expression of a man in complete command of his environment. His eyes passed over the gallery. They did not stop on any of the 4 people with legal pads. He did not know to look for them. He was looking for the specific face of Gregory Sloan, whom he had expected and who was not there, and the absence of that face had produced a small, controlled tightening somewhere behind his eyes that he did not let reach his expression. Irene Cole stood when the judge called the case. She presented her materials clearly and without theatrical emphasis. The gas station receipt, the location data, the text messages, printed and organized with timestamps, each one verified through the carrier's records which she had obtained through proper legal process. The surveillance record from the camera on the corner of Westfield and 4th, which showed, with timestamp, that Marcus Hale was not where the prosecution claimed he was at the time the prosecution claimed he was there. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She simply presented one document after another in the manner of someone laying down tiles, each one fitting precisely against the last, until the shape of the truth was visible to anyone in the room who was willing to look at it. Raymond Voss sustained every objection the prosecution raised. He ruled the surveillance record inadmissible on procedural grounds related to the chain of custody, grounds that Irene noted for the record were not consistent with how the court had treated comparable evidence in 3 prior cases, a point that she made quietly and that Raymond acknowledged with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been making rulings he knew were wrong for a very long time and had developed techniques for not showing it. He set sentencing for the following Friday. He collected his papers and prepared to rise. Irene Cole said, clearly and for the record, that the defense wished to preserve all grounds for appeal. Raymond looked at her. She looked back at him. He rose and left the bench. Marcus sat at the defense table for a moment after the judge was gone. Irene put a hand briefly on his forearm and said they were not finished, and that what had happened today was not the end of this. She said it in the specific way of someone who knows something they cannot yet say, which is a manner that Marcus, for the first time in weeks, found more comforting than alarming. He walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon. The sky was overcast and the air tasted like rain that had not arrived yet. He stood on the steps and breathed. The white van was in its usual spot across the street. Marcus had noticed it before. He noticed it again now. He did not know what it was. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that sits at the edge of your understanding, familiar enough to register, not clear enough to name. Then he went down the steps and got into his uncle's waiting car. Darnell asked how it went. Marcus said the judge had ruled against them on everything. Darnell said he had expected that. Marcus asked if that was supposed to make him feel better. Darnell said no. He said it was just a fact. He said facts were useful even when they were not comforting. He drove them away from the courthouse. Raymond Voss walked to his car in the reserved parking area at the side of the building. He walked at his usual pace. He did not look around. He passed the front edge of the building and crossed the small concrete apron that led to the parking area. He passed within 12 feet of the white panel van. He stopped. He looked at it. It was an ordinary van, white, no markings. Standard commercial plates. It had been there a long time. He was not sure why he had not noticed it before. He was not sure, now that he had noticed it, what he was noticing. He stood there for a moment. Inside the van, the feed from the exterior camera showed Raymond Voss standing completely still, looking at the vehicle. Carol Deming watched the monitor. Philip Carr, beside her, set down his coffee. Philip asked quietly if they should do anything. Carol did not answer immediately. She watched Raymond Voss on the monitor. He was not moving. He was just standing there, looking at the van with an expression that was very hard to read from a camera feed, but that Carol, who had been watching him for 14 months, recognized as the specific expression of a man who has felt something shift beneath him and cannot yet identify what it is. Then he turned and walked to his car. He got in. He sat for a moment without starting the engine. Then he started the engine and drove out of the lot. Philip asked again if they should do anything. Carol said no. She said they had 5 days. She went back to her paperwork. Outside the courthouse, rain finally arrived, slow and steady, the kind of rain that does not make a sound so much as it changes the quality of everything in it. It darkened the concrete of the parking lot. It moved across the roof of the van, without a response from anyone inside. Marcus Hale, 3 miles away, sat in a diner with his uncle and drank coffee and looked at the rain through the window. Darnell was talking about something, a story from his postal route years ago, something about a dog and a parcel, and a man named Norris who had a very specific attitude toward receiving mail. Marcus was half listening. The other half of him was somewhere else entirely, in a version of the next 5 days that he could not yet see clearly. Darnell paused mid-story and looked at his nephew. He told Marcus he was going to be all right. Marcus looked at him. Darnell said he did not say things he did not mean, and that Marcus knew that, and that he was telling him he was going to be all right. Marcus looked at his coffee. He said he knew. He did not say whether he believed it yet. The rain came down. The enrollment forms were in his jacket pocket. Friday was 5 days away. In the van, Carol Deming picked up her phone and made the 3rd call, the one she had been building toward for 14 months. She made it short. She gave the relevant details. She confirmed the timeline. She said the warrant needed to be ready to execute by Friday morning early before the courthouse opened. The person on the other end confirmed. Carol ended the call and set the phone down. She looked at the board one final time that evening. Every photograph, every line, every name. Raymond Voss at the center of it, connected to everything, aware of none of this. She turned off the overhead light in the van. Philip poured the last of the coffee. They waited. Friday came with clear sky and sharp cold, the kind of morning that has no mercy in it. The sun was low and bright and put long shadows across everything. The courthouse parking lot was empty when the first vehicles arrived at 6:41 in the morning. The vehicles were not press. They were not legal staff. They were 4 federal agents in 2 cars, and they parked at angles that blocked both exits of the lot. Carol Deming had already been in position for an hour. She was not in the van this morning. The van had moved. She was standing on the pavement in a dark jacket with her badge on a lanyard, watching the lot fill with people who had no idea what the morning was about to become. Philip was to her left, 3 steps back, watching the entrance to the lot. The arrest warrant for Raymond Voss had been signed at 6:47 the previous morning by a federal judge in the district court 1 state over. It named Raymond Voss as the primary subject and listed 11 co-conspirators. It was based on 14 months of surveillance records, 6 months of financial documentation, the formal testimony of 2 confidential informants, 43 recorded phone calls, and a complete paper trail that connected the defendant to a pattern of judicial corruption involving manipulated verdicts, suppressed evidence, and the receipt of payments through a layered financial structure involving 3 shell entities and 1 legitimate business. It was, Carol had been told by her supervisor, one of the cleaner cases the division had produced in several years. She had thanked him without much expression. She was focused on the morning. Raymond Voss arrived at 7:58. He parked in his reserved spot. He got out of his car carrying his briefcase, wearing his coat, moving at his usual deliberate pace. He had a coffee from a place 2 blocks away. He did not look around the lot in the way he had looked around it on Wednesday evening. He had apparently decided whatever he felt when he looked at the van was nothing. Carol watched him walk toward the building entrance. She waited until he had cleared his car and was in the open middle of the lot, nowhere near any door. Then she walked forward. She said his name. He turned. She held up her badge and identified herself. She stated the bureau, her name, and her role. She told him he was under federal arrest. She stated the charge in the language of the warrant, clearly and without editorializing. Raymond Voss looked at her badge. He looked at her face. He looked at the other agents, who had moved to positions around him in a way that was professional and unhurried. The movement of people doing something they have rehearsed, not because it is complicated but because precision matters. He looked at the courthouse entrance. A thought passed across his face that Carol read without difficulty. He was calculating whether there was anything to be done. He was doing the calculation of a man who had spent 22 years in a position of authority, a man for whom the answer to most problems was available because he was the one who made the answers available. He was doing that calculation and arriving, for what was possibly the first time in a very long time, at a total of 0. He looked back at Carol. He said he wanted his attorney. Carol said he could call his attorney the moment they reached the processing facility. She told him she was required to inform him of his rights, and she did so, fully and precisely. She confirmed he understood. He said he understood. Philip Carr stepped forward with the handcuffs. Raymond Voss put his briefcase down on the pavement. He set his coffee beside it. He put his hands behind his back. He said nothing further. They walked him to one of the federal vehicles. He walked without resisting, without speaking, without performing anything. He simply walked the way a man walks when the particular long game he has been playing for many years has reached the end of its last move, and there is nothing left to perform. Inside the courthouse, the morning was just beginning. Staff were arriving. The clerk's office was opening. The daily calendar was being prepared. Courtroom 2, which was Raymond Voss's courtroom, was being unlocked for the day. In the gallery of that courtroom, at 9:02, Marcus Hale sat at the defense table with Irene Cole beside him. He had his enrollment forms in his jacket pocket. He had not known what the morning would bring when he left his apartment. He had told his uncle he would call when it was done. The bailiff came in through the side door and spoke briefly to the court clerk. The clerk looked at a piece of paper the bailiff handed her. She looked at it for a moment without visible expression and then set it down. She announced to the room that the morning's proceedings were being suspended, pending a matter that had arisen earlier that morning. The room was quiet. A man near the back of the gallery, one of the 4 people with legal pads who had been there on Wednesday, stood up and walked forward. He identified himself to the clerk in a low voice and handed her a second document. Irene Cole looked at the document the clerk was now holding. She recognized the header. She recognized the case number. She looked at Marcus. She said his name quietly. He looked at her. She told him that the charges against him had been suspended by federal order pending the completion of the related federal proceedings, and that based on the evidence she had filed and the federal action, she expected them to be dismissed in full within a short period of time. Marcus looked at her. He said the word dismissed. She said yes. He sat still for a moment. Then he put his hand inside his jacket and touched the enrollment forms. He did not cry. He did not speak for a while. He looked at the front of the courtroom where the bench sat empty, the high chair behind the high wood, the seat that was supposed to represent the idea that justice had a fixed location and a fixed address and could be found there whenever needed. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took the enrollment forms out of his jacket pocket and set them on the table in front of him, and looked at them instead. Darnell got the call at 9:23. He was in his car in the courthouse parking lot because he had not been able to make himself drive away. He answered before the second ring. Marcus told him what had happened. Darnell did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he told him. Marcus said he knew. Darnell said to come outside. Marcus said he would be right there. He folded the enrollment forms carefully and put them back in his jacket pocket and picked up his bag and walked out of the courtroom, down the corridor, through the main doors, and out into the morning. The sun was still low and sharp. The cold was still the kind that does not offer comfort. He stood on the steps and looked at the parking lot. The white van was gone. In its place was an empty space of pavement that looked like nothing in particular, which was precisely what it was. The work was done. The 14 months of patience and documentation and carefully withheld information had resolved into a morning that lasted approximately 4 minutes in a courthouse parking lot and changed the shape of everything. Carol Deming was already back at the federal field office, sitting at her desk, working through the first of what would be several hundred pages of post-arrest documentation. She would be doing paperwork for weeks. That was the part that nobody who made films about law enforcement ever showed. The arrests were the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. The sentence itself was built out of paperwork and patience, and the kind of sustained attention that does not look like anything dramatic from the outside. She had a photograph on her desk. It was the same one from her board, a photo of Raymond Voss taken outside the courthouse. It was there not as a trophy but as a reminder of what the work was for. She would file it away when the case was fully processed. For now it sat on the corner of her desk, and she looked at it occasionally, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific feeling of someone who has done something correctly, completely, and without any shortcuts, and is allowing themselves one moment to acknowledge that before moving on to the next thing. Raymond Voss was processed and transferred to federal holding. He requested his attorney 7 times in the first 2 hours, which was his right, and the attorney arrived within the hour, which was efficient. The attorney reviewed the documentation that was presented to him and was very quiet for a long period of time, which told Raymond more about his situation than anything else that had happened that morning. The 11 co-conspirators were picked up that same day in a coordinated set of arrests across 3 locations. The network that had been operating through Harlan County for a decade was not dismantled in a single morning, but the morning was the point at which it became impossible for it to continue. The financial structures were frozen. The communications were logged. The shell entities were flagged for dissolution proceedings. These things would take time to fully complete. They would complete. Caroline Webb received a call at 9:45 that morning from the man she had spoken with 6 weeks earlier, the one who had asked her not to publish. He told her the federal arrests had been made and that she was free to publish what she had. He told her the full case file would be available through the federal court's public access system within 72 hours. She thanked him. He said she was welcome and that he was sorry it had taken so long to give her the story. She said she had used the time well. He said he knew. He said he had read her work. She started writing the article before she even ended the call. It was not the article she had originally planned to write 8 months ago when this started. It was considerably larger. It named names that had not been in her original research. It traced the full financial architecture. It included the story of Marcus Hale, told with his permission, obtained in a phone call she made between the Federal News coming out and filing her copy. Marcus had answered on the first ring. She had told him who she was and why she was calling. He had been quiet for a moment and then said his uncle had mentioned her. She had asked if he was willing to talk. He said yes. She asked how he was doing. He was quiet again for a moment. She could hear the sound of a car, wind, movement. He was outside somewhere. He said he was going to the registration office. She said she was glad. He said he was too. The article ran the following morning. It was the lead story. It included the surveillance records, the financial documents, the text messages that Darnell had kept and organized with such care, and the account of 14 months of federal investigation that had run silently alongside everything else. It included a brief statement from the FBI's Public Affairs Office confirming the arrests and referencing the ongoing proceedings. It did not include the name of the agent who had called Caroline and asked her to wait. She had agreed not to use it. She understood that some of the most important work in any story is done by people whose names cannot be in the story, and she respected that the way she respected most things about the work, which was sincerely and practically, and without much ceremony. Darnell read the article at his kitchen table the morning it ran, with his coffee in the early light before the rest of the day started. He read it all the way through. He set it down. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered and said he had already seen it. Darnell said it was good writing. Marcus said he thought so too. Darnell asked if he was going to school today. Marcus said yes. He had class at 10, logistics and supply chain management. The professor had sent the first week's reading list, and Marcus had already started it because he was the kind of person who started things promptly when the starting was finally within reach. Darnell said that was good. Marcus said he would call later. He ended the call and got ready for class. He left his apartment at 9:15, walked to his car, put his bag in the passenger seat. He had the enrollment forms somewhere in his bag now, no longer in his pocket, filed away in a folder because they had served their purpose as a daily reminder and were now just documents, ordinary and complete. He started the car and drove. The morning was clear and cold, and the light was the kind that makes edges sharp and distances readable. He drove toward the college with the focused, unremarkable purpose of someone simply going where they said they were going. No one followed him. No one needed to.